Somewhere beneath the sands of what is now southern Iraq, archaeologists once pulled clay tablets out of the ruins of a burned library, covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into mud thousands of years before anyone had ever heard of Greece or Rome. When those marks were finally translated, they turned out to contain a story so old it may be the very first great work of literature ever written down, about a king who lost his best friend, went mad with grief, and set out on a journey to the edge of the world to find a way to cheat death itself. He never found what he was looking for, but what he found instead may be even more interesting. This is the entire story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, from the tyrant king who terrorized his own city, to the wild man sent to stop him, to the flood that nearly wiped out humanity, and everything in between. The real king behind the legend. Before getting into the story itself, it helps to understand that Gilgamesh was not simply invented out of nothing by ancient storytellers. According to an ancient record known as the Sumerian King List, a document listing generations of rulers believed to have governed the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, a king named Gilgamesh is recorded as having ruled the city of Uruk sometime around the 27th century before the Common Era, positioning him as a real historical figure who lived and governed roughly 4,500 years ago, during a period when writing itself was still a relatively new invention, and the very concept of a city was still a novel and remarkable achievement for human civilization. Very little can be confirmed with certainty about the actual historical Gilgamesh, and the figure who appears in the epic itself had already been transformed considerably by the time the story reached the form modern readers know today, layered over with centuries of legend, poetry, and religious significance that gradually turned a mortal king into a being, described as two-thirds divine. The Sumerian king list itself only adds to the mystery surrounding his actual reign, since it records implausibly long lifespans for many of the earliest rulers listed alongside him, figures said to have reigned for hundreds or even thousands of years apiece. A detail scholars generally attribute to symbolic or ceremonial numbering conventions rather than literal historical fact, making it difficult to say with any real precision how long Gilgamesh himself may have actually ruled, or how many of the specific events later attributed to him in the epic might trace back to genuine deeds performed by a real king rather than embellishments added by generations of later storytellers. The earliest stories about him appear to have circulated among the Sumerian people in the form of separate, shorter poems, composed in the Sumerian language and centered around individual episodes from his life and reign, rather than existing as one single continuous narrative from the very beginning. Over the following centuries, spanning roughly the 18th century before the Common Era through to around the 12th century before the Common Era, these originally separate stories were gradually gathered together, expanded upon, and eventually woven into a single unified narrative composed in the Akkadian language, the language spoken across much of ancient Mesopotamia during this later period. The most complete and celebrated version of this unified narrative, often referred to today as the Standard Babylonian Version, is generally credited to a scribe and scholar named Sinleki-Unnini, who is believed to have compiled and shaped the story into something close to the form that would eventually be copied onto the tablets discovered by archaeologists thousands of years later. Little is known about Sinleki-Unnini himself beyond his name and his evident skill as an editor and poet, though later Mesopotamian scribal tradition remembered him with considerable respect, occasionally listing him among a small group of legendary sages credited with producing some of the most important literary works of the ancient world. A level of recognition that suggests his particular arrangement of the Gilgamesh material was regarded, even in antiquity, as a genuine achievement rather than a simple act of copying older material without alteration. With this layered history in mind, tracing the story from a real historical ruler through centuries of poetic reworking into the epic tale finally uncovered by modern archaeologists, It's worth understanding why the ancient audiences who first told and retold this story found nothing strange about describing a real, once-living king as two-thirds divine. Kingship in this period was rarely presented as an ordinary human institution passed down through bloodline alone, but rather as something granted and sustained through an ongoing relationship with the gods themselves, meaning that a ruler's extraordinary qualities, strength, wisdom, even physical beauty, were often understood as visible proof of divine favour rather than simple genetic inheritance. Throughout ancient Mesopotamian civilization, kingship itself was understood as an institution granted directly by the gods, with individual rulers frequently claiming some degree of divine ancestry or divine favour as a way of legitimizing their rule over the people beneath them. Gilgamesh's own mother, the goddess Ninsun, appears repeatedly throughout the epic, offering guidance, prayer and protection to her son, while his father, the earlier king Lugalbanda, was likewise remembered in separate Sumerian poems as a figure of considerable legendary stature in his own right, a warrior and wanderer, whose own adventures had once been celebrated independently of his son's later, more famous story. These older Lugalbanda poems described a king who survived abandonment in a remote mountain wilderness after falling ill during a military campaign, eventually earning the favour of a great mythical bird through an act of kindness and gaining from it the extraordinary speed and endurance that would define his own reputation. Adventures that, while distinct from anything Gilgamesh himself experiences in his own epic, helped establish the broader sense of an entire family line marked by remarkable, almost supernatural capability, stretching back at least a generation before Gilgamesh's own birth. This blending of mortal kingship with divine ancestry served an important cultural purpose beyond simple flattery of a beloved ruler, offering the people of Uruk a way of understanding why their king possessed such extraordinary capabilities in the first place, while also setting up one of the epic's most central and enduring tensions, the fact that despite this divine heritage, despite his extraordinary strength and beauty and wisdom, Gilgamesh remained in the end mortal, subject to the same ultimate fate as every ordinary person he ruled over. This tension between godlike ability and inescapable human mortality sits at the very heart of everything that follows throughout the rest of the story, and it's worth keeping in mind as the narrative now turns toward the being created specifically to challenge and eventually humble this seemingly invincible king. Worth noting, too, is how the ancient scribes themselves chose to open this particular telling of the story, describing their own king not first through his conquests or his cruelty, but through knowledge, calling him the one who had seen everything, who had learned the sum of wisdom, who had journeyed to distant places and returned to record what he had witnessed for the benefit of those who came after him. This framing device was not unusual for the period, since Mesopotamian literary works frequently opened by establishing the authority and first-hand experience of their central figure before diving into the events of the story itself, a technique meant to reassure the listener that what followed carried the weight of genuine testimony rather than idle invention. This opening framing casts the entire epic as something closer to a record left behind by Gilgamesh himself, a message from a king determined that his experiences, joys, sorrows, and failures alike would not simply vanish once his own life reached its end, an intention that, whether or not it was ever truly his own, has certainly proven accurate across the thousands of years since these words were first pressed into clay. Whoever first composed these opening lines, whether an anonymous court scribe working centuries after Gilgamesh's actual reign, or a later compiler drawing together older material into a single continuous account, understood something essential about what makes a story worth preserving, that even a king blessed with strength and beauty beyond ordinary measure could still be remembered. In the end, for something far more relatable than any of his conquests, the simple universal fear of losing someone he loved, and the desperate hope of somehow being remembered himself once he too was gone. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. Long before the story really begins, there was a city called Uruk, one of the very first true cities to ever exist anywhere on Earth, sitting along the banks of the Euphrates River in the region later known as Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq. Uruk was enormous by the standards of its time, protected by an enormous wall that stretched for miles around the city, a wall the story itself takes considerable pride in describing, built from fired brick and said to be so impressive that visitors were encouraged to walk along its length and marvel at the sheer scale of what human hands had accomplished. Within those walls lived a population considerable enough to make Uruk one of the largest and most influential settlements anywhere in the ancient world during this early period. Its streets filled with merchants, farmers, priests, and craftsmen going about their daily lives beneath the shadow of temples dedicated to Anu and Ishtar, the twin deities most closely associated with the city's own spiritual identity. Gilgamesh himself was said to have deposited an account of his own travels and struggles inside a copper box hidden somewhere within the foundation of this very wall. A small but telling detail suggesting that the entire narrative that follows was meant to be understood as a message left behind for future generations, sealed away by the king's own hand for anyone determined enough to eventually find it. Ruling over this city was a king named Gilgamesh, described from the very opening lines of the story as 2/3 divine and only 1/3 human, the son of a goddess named Ninsun and a previous king of Uruk named Lugalbanda. This unusual heritage gave Gilgamesh extraordinary strength, beauty, and vitality, unlike any ordinary man, making him a magnificent king in terms of raw physical and mental gifts. Tall, radiant, wise in certain matters, and utterly without equal in combat or in council. His people had once taken genuine pride in claiming such a ruler, boasting to neighbouring cities about the height of their walls, the depth of their canals, and the sheer physical presence of the man who governed them. Envoys from distant lands were said to return home, describing him with something close to awe, unable to point to any warrior or scholar in their own courts capable of matching him. But magnificent gifts did not necessarily make him a good ruler, and the story wastes little time establishing that Gilgamesh, for all his extraordinary qualities, had become something considerably more troubling to the people forced to live under him. Gilgamesh ruled Uruk with an overwhelming restless energy that his own subjects had grown to dread. He pushed the young men of the city into endless labour and competition, exhausting them with demands that left them no time for their own families or their own lives, forcing them into grueling contests of strength and endurance simply to satisfy his own restless need for constant activity and challenge. Toward the young women of Uruk, his behaviour was even more troubling, with the story describing him taking whichever woman caught his interest, regardless of her own wishes or her existing marriage, treating the entire city as though it existed purely to satisfy his own appetites. Fathers lost their sons to his relentless demands for labour and combat training, and new brides found their wedding nights interrupted by a king who considered himself entitled to claim them before their own husbands ever could, a custom the story presents as a genuine and ongoing source of dread among the ordinary families of the city, one that struck at the heart of their most sacred and personal celebrations. The suffering grew severe enough that the people of Uruk eventually cried out to the gods themselves, unable to find any other remedy for a king whose power over them seemed absolute and unchallengeable by ordinary means, gathering together to lament their situation aloud and beg for some form of intervention from above, since no mortal authority within the city itself held any power capable of restraining their own king's behaviour. They directed their pleas specifically toward Anu, describing every grievance in detail: the exhausted young men, the violated brides, the households left in disarray by a ruler who answered to no one, hoping that the god who stood above even Gilgamesh's own divine mother might finally take notice of what his blessing upon their king had actually produced for the ordinary people forced to live beneath him. Their prayers reached Anu, the great sky god, and the head of the entire pantheon of Mesopotamian deities, and through him reached Uruk, the goddess responsible for creating humanity in the first place, back when the world itself was still young. The gods, hearing the desperate pleas of Uruk's citizens, agreed that Gilgamesh needed a counterbalance, someone capable of matching his extraordinary strength and drawing his restless energy towards something other than the exhausted misery of his own people. Rather than removing Gilgamesh from power entirely, which the gods seemed unwilling to do given his own divine heritage, they decided instead to create someone equal to him, a rival strong enough to challenge him directly, and in doing so, redirect the entire course of his life. Uruk accepted this task, and it was a fitting one for her to take on, since she was remembered among the Mesopotamian gods as the very deity responsible for shaping the first human beings out of clay at the dawn of time, sometimes known under the title Belet Ili, meaning Lady of the Gods, a figure whose skill at forming living creatures out of ordinary River Earth made her uniquely suited to producing something powerful enough to match a king already blessed with divine strength of his own. What she created next would set the entire story in motion. Stick around, because what Uruk made next wasn't another king, another warrior trained in a palace, or another noble raised among comfort and privilege. What she made was something entirely wild, formed from nothing but river clay and the untamed spirit of the natural world itself, a creature who would spend his earliest days running alongside gazelles rather than walking among men. The creation of Enkidu. To create a match for Gilgamesh, Uruk went out to the wilderness and washed her hands, then pinched off a piece of clay from the riverbank, gathering it carefully and shaping it into the form of a man unlike any other, working the wet earth with the same deliberate skill she had once used to shape humanity itself back when the world was still young. She pinched off pieces and formed them into a powerful, muscular body, then let this creation fall onto the open steppe far from any city or settlement, giving him life there among the wild grasses and open plains, far from the noise and structure of Uruk and any other human settlement. This being became known as Enkidu, and from the very moment of his creation, he was something fundamentally different from any other human being described in the story. The land where he first opened his eyes stretched wide and empty in every direction, grasses bending under a wind that carried no scent of smoke or cooking fire, no sound of voices or footsteps, nothing but the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle of some animal moving through the brush nearby, a world entirely untouched by anything resembling human settlement. Enkidu's entire body was covered in thick hair, his hair itself grown long and matted like that of the grain goddess Nisaba, and he possessed none of the customs or knowledge that separated civilized humanity from the animal world around him. He knew nothing of bread, nothing of proper clothing, nothing of speech as other humans understood it, and nothing of the social structures that governed cities like Uruk. Instead, he ran with herds of gazelle across the open plains, ate grass alongside them, and drank from watering holes shoulder to shoulder with wild animals who accepted him entirely as one of their own, moving with the same instinctive grace and wariness that governed every other creature living out on the open steppe. He was, in every meaningful sense, a wild man, powerful beyond ordinary human capability, but living a life indistinguishable from the beasts around him. Travellers passing near the edges of his territory occasionally caught brief glimpses of him from a distance, always in the company of animals, never approaching a settlement or showing any interest in the handful of merchants who sometimes crossed through the region, stories of these sightings eventually filtering back toward the cities of the plain as little more than rumour, a wild man said to run faster than any horse and match the strength of any bull, dismissed by most who heard the tale as exaggeration born from a traveller's own fear of the open wilderness. Enkidu's presence in the wilderness eventually caused a considerable problem for a trapper who worked the region, setting snares and pits to catch game for his livelihood. Each day, the trapper found his carefully set traps destroyed, filled in, or otherwise ruined, and eventually he caught sight of the cause: an enormous hair-covered man running freely among the animals, tearing apart traps and freeing captured game as though he understood exactly what the devices were meant to do and had decided to personally prevent them from working. Pits carefully dug and covered with brush lay exposed and empty by morning. Snares meant to catch a gazelle by the leg, found untied and coiled neatly to one side, as though deliberately dismantled rather than simply broken through by accident, a level of precision that convinced the trapper this was no ordinary animal disturbing his work, but something with genuine understanding of what it was undoing. The trapper stood frozen at the sight for a long while, watching from a hidden distance as this powerful figure moved among gazelles and wild oxen with the same unhurried ease as any other creature of the steppe. His face, according to the account, went pale with shock, his heart pounding with a fear unlike anything his ordinary work had ever caused him, and he returned home that night unable to eat or find any rest, disturbed by what he had witnessed, and uncertain how he could possibly continue his trade with such a creature roaming freely across his hunting grounds. Enkidu's sheer strength and speed, combined with his evident sympathy for the animals he lived among, made him far more than the trapper could handle alone. Terrified and unable to solve the problem through his own efforts, the trapper travelled into Uruk to seek help, eventually bringing his troubles before Gilgamesh himself, describing the wild man who had made his profession impossible to continue. Gilgamesh, hearing the description of this powerful, uncivilized figure living out on the steppe, proposed a solution that would ultimately change the course of the entire story, though not at all in the way anyone involved expected at the time. Gilgamesh listened carefully to every detail the trapper offered, asking after the wild man's height, his strength, and the particular way he moved among the herds. And rather than dismissing the account as exaggeration, he seemed to recognize almost immediately that something significant was being described to him, something worth investigating rather than ignoring or leaving to lesser men to handle. Rather than sending soldiers or hunters to capture or kill the wild man by force, Gilgamesh suggested a different approach entirely, one built around understanding rather than conflict. He instructed the trapper to bring a woman from the temple of Ishtar, a priestess trained specifically in matters of love and physical intimacy, out to the wilderness where Enkidu could be found. The plan was for her to approach Enkidu directly, and through her presence and attention, draw him gradually away from his purely animal existence and into something closer to human experience and understanding. This woman, whose name was Shamhat, agreed to the task, and what happened next would transform Enkidu completely, setting him on a path that would eventually bring him face to face with the very king whose city he had never even seen. Women serving in this particular role within the temple of Ishtar held a recognized and respected position within Mesopotamian religious life, associated with the goddess's own domain over love and fertility, and considered skilled in matters that extended well beyond simple companionship, trained in music, conversation, and the customs of civilized society in ways that made Shamhat an especially fitting choice for the delicate task Gilgamesh had assigned her. Shamhat and Enkidu's transformation. Following the trapper's guidance, Shamhat travelled out to the watering hole where Enkidu was known to gather with the wild animals he lived among, and there she waited for him to appear, sitting patiently for 3 full days according to the account, until Enkidu finally arrived, alongside his usual companions from the herd, moving among them with the same easy, unhurried confidence of any other creature drinking from the water's edge. When Enkidu eventually arrived, Shamhat approached him openly, uncovering herself and calling to him without any hesitation, and over the course of several days, the two of them spent considerable time together, with Shamhat gently and patiently drawing Enkidu into an experience of intimacy and closeness, entirely unlike anything he had known during his life among the animals of the steppe. This encounter marked a profound turning point for Enkidu, changing him in ways that went far beyond the immediate experience itself. When he attempted afterward to return to his former life among the gazelles, running alongside them as he always had, he discovered that something fundamental had shifted within him. The animals, catching his scent on the wind and sensing the change that had come over him, bolted away the moment he drew near, scattering across the plain rather than allowing him to run alongside them the way he always had before, leaving him standing alone and confused at the edge of the herd he had once called his own. His body, too, felt different, no longer capable of the same effortless speed that had once let him keep pace with wild herds across open ground, his legs suddenly heavy and unfamiliar beneath him. Rather than despairing over this loss, Enkidu found that he had gained something else in its place, a new kind of understanding and awareness that the story describes as a form of wisdom entering into him, a dawning sense of thought and reason that his purely animal existence had never required or allowed. Shamhat, recognizing the change taking place within him, encouraged him to embrace this new understanding rather than mourn what he had lost, and began the process of teaching him the basics of human civilization, how to eat bread rather than grass, how to drink beer rather than simply water, and eventually how to wear proper clothing rather than going about entirely unclothed and covered only in his own thick hair, which was gradually trimmed and groomed to resemble that of an ordinary man. Enkidu's first attempts at these ordinary human customs proved clumsy at first, fumbling with the unfamiliar shape of bread in his hands and reacting with visible confusion to the taste and effect of beer, drinking cup after cup until his mood lifted and his heart grew light, singing aloud and washing himself for the first time with water and oil in a manner Shamhat carefully demonstrated for him. Bit by bit, over the course of several days, he began to resemble something closer to an ordinary man than the wild creature who had once run alongside gazelles across the open steppe. As Enkidu grew increasingly comfortable in this new civilized existence, Shamhat began telling him about the city of Uruk and its king, describing Gilgamesh in vivid terms, his extraordinary strength, his radiant divine heritage, and notably his considerable abuses of power over his own people. She described the temples and marketplaces, the crowds of people going about their daily business, and the festivals held throughout the year, painting a picture of a world entirely unlike anything Enkidu had known during his years alone on the steppe, one filled with noise, colour, and the constant press of other human beings living closely together. Rather than being deterred by descriptions of a king so powerful and so willing to use that power however he pleased, Enkidu found himself filled with a growing determination to travel to Uruk and confront this king directly, feeling an instinctive sense that Gilgamesh's behaviour toward his own people was wrong and needed to be challenged by someone capable of standing up to him. Shamhat, for her part, encouraged this determination, seeming to recognize that Enkidu's arrival in Uruk was exactly the kind of counterbalance the city so desperately needed. She continued teaching him along the journey toward the city, further preparing him for the very different kind of existence that awaited him among the crowded streets and structured society of urban life, a world entirely unlike anything he had known during his earlier years running wild across the open steppe. As Enkidu and Shamhat made their way toward Uruk, they stopped for a time among a camp of shepherds along the way, and there Enkidu proved his usefulness in an entirely new capacity, taking up watch over the flocks through the night and driving off wolves and lions that had long troubled the herdsmen, allowing the shepherds to sleep peacefully for the first time in longer than they could remember. The shepherds, grateful and increasingly fond of their unexpected guardian, continued teaching him the customs of settled life alongside Shamhat, showing him how to properly cut and prepare meat, how to drink from a proper cup rather than kneeling at a stream, and how to conduct himself among people rather than animals. Word of a mysterious wild man travelling from the wilderness had already begun reaching the city itself, along with a series of unsettling dreams that had recently troubled Gilgamesh. Dreams that, once interpreted, suggested something significant was about to enter his life, something powerful enough to shake even a king who had never before encountered anyone capable of matching him. Gilgamesh's dreams and the first meeting. Before Enkidu ever arrived in Uruk, Gilgamesh experienced a pair of unsettling dreams that left him deeply troubled, prompting him to seek out his mother, the goddess Ninsun, for guidance on what they might mean. In the first dream, Gilgamesh saw a massive object falling from the sky, so heavy that he alone could not move it despite his best efforts, drawing a crowd of onlookers who gathered around to marvel at it alongside him, and describing a growing attraction and affection toward the object, as though it called to him the way a person might feel drawn toward a cherished companion. The object in this first dream was sometimes described as resembling a great weight or star, its surface catching the light in a manner that drew the eye of every onlooker gathered around it, and Gilgamesh recalled straining against it with all his considerable strength, unable to shift it even slightly, yet feeling no frustration at this failure, only a strange, unfamiliar tenderness he could not fully explain even to himself upon waking. In the second dream, Gilgamesh saw an axe lying in the street of Uruk, again drawing a crowd, and again feeling that same powerful pull of affection toward the object, embracing it the way one might embrace someone deeply loved. Gilgamesh described both dreams to his mother in careful detail, recounting the exact sensations he had felt in each, the weight of the object falling from the sky, the shape and gleam of the axe lying in the roadway, and the strange, unfamiliar tenderness that had washed over him in both dreams toward objects that, by any ordinary measure, should have inspired fear rather than affection. Ninsun, hearing both dreams described in detail, offered her son an interpretation that would prove entirely accurate. She listened carefully to each detail he offered, taking her time before responding, weighing the significance of the falling object and the axe against everything she understood of prophecy and the workings of fate, her expression shifting gradually from concern to something closer to quiet relief as the meaning became clear to her. She explained that both dreams pointed toward the arrival of a powerful companion, someone who would come to Uruk from the wilderness, someone Gilgamesh would grow to love as deeply and as fiercely as he might love a brother, a friend capable of standing beside him and sharing in whatever difficulties lay ahead. Gilgamesh, hearing this interpretation, found himself both intrigued and reassured, though the full meaning of his mother's words would only become clear once Enkidu actually arrived within the city walls. He thought often, in the days that followed, about the strange tenderness he had felt in both dreams toward objects that ought to have inspired only fear, wondering privately what kind of companion could possibly draw such an unusual and unfamiliar response from him, a man who had rarely, if ever, felt anything close to genuine affection toward anyone outside his own family. That arrival came at a particularly charged moment, timed to coincide with one of Gilgamesh's ongoing abuses of his royal privileges. According to the story, Enkidu made his way into Uruk just as Gilgamesh was preparing to exercise his customary right to visit a new bride on her wedding night before her own husband could do so, a practice that had become one of the most bitterly resented aspects of his rule among the ordinary people of the city. Scholars who study the epic have long debated whether this particular custom reflected an actual, widely practiced legal right claimed by real Mesopotamian rulers, or whether it functioned instead as a piece of storytelling Shorthand meant simply to illustrate, in the starkest possible terms, just how thoroughly Gilgamesh had overstepped the proper boundaries of his kingship by this point in the narrative. Either way, the scene establishes the practice as a source of genuine terror and resentment among the ordinary families of Uruk, precisely the kind of grievance that had originally driven the city's people to beg the gods for intervention. Enkidu, having already developed a clear sense that such behaviour was deeply wrong, positioned himself directly in the doorway of the wedding chamber, physically blocking Gilgamesh's path and refusing to allow him to proceed. For a brief moment before the fighting began, the two men simply stood facing one another across the threshold, neither willing to step aside, the assembled wedding guests falling silent as they sensed the confrontation building between the enormous stranger blocking the doorway and their own king, whose reputation for both strength and temper was well known throughout the city. This confrontation escalated immediately into a physical struggle between the two men, an enormous clash of strength that the story describes in vivid terms, the two of them grappling and wrestling with such tremendous force that the very doorposts of the building shook and cracked under the impact of their struggle, the walls themselves trembling as though the entire city might come apart around them. A crowd gathered quickly around the wedding house, drawn by the noise of the confrontation, wedding guests and curious onlookers alike, pressing close to watch two men fight with a ferocity none of them had ever witnessed, dust rising thick around the combatants as they crashed against walls and door frames, neither one willing to yield an inch to the other despite the punishment each blow inflicted. The fight raged on for a considerable stretch, neither man able to gain a clear and lasting advantage over the other, each of them matched almost perfectly in raw strength and sheer determination. Eventually, however, Gilgamesh managed to gain the upper hand, though only barely, forcing Enkidu down in a display of strength that finally settled the immediate physical contest between them. But rather than this defeat ending in bitterness or continued hostility, something remarkable happened instead. Once the physical struggle had run its course, Gilgamesh's anger seemed to dissolve entirely, replaced by genuine respect and admiration for the sheer power and determination Enkidu had shown him, the first true equal he had ever encountered in his entire life. Enkidu, for his part, found his own anger cooling as well, recognizing in Gilgamesh not simply a tyrant to be opposed, but someone whose extraordinary qualities matched and perhaps even exceeded his own. The two men embraced there in the doorway, still catching their breath, and from that moment forward became inseparable, spending their days together in the city and quickly earning a reputation among the people of Uruk as companions bound by something far stronger than ordinary friendship. A bond the story elsewhere compares to that of true brothers, forged not through shared blood, but through the sheer force of that single violent afternoon. Word of the reconciliation spread quickly through Uruk, and a considerable feast was held in celebration, the people of the city gathering to see for themselves this newly formed friendship between their king and the powerful stranger who had once threatened to disrupt their own wedding celebrations. The elders of the city, many of whom had once quietly hoped for exactly this kind of outcome when they first heard of Aruru's creation, watched the two men walk together through the streets with a sense of cautious relief, remarking to one another that whatever else came of this strange new friendship, at least the wedding night custom that had caused their own daughters and sons such grief seemed unlikely to continue in quite the same manner going forward. Rather than fearing this pairing of two such extraordinary figures, the citizens of Uruk found themselves cautiously hopeful, sensing that whatever restless energy Gilgamesh had once directed against them might now find a different, less destructive outlet through his newfound companion. From this violent first encounter, an unlikely and deeply meaningful friendship began to form between the two men, one that would come to define the entire remainder of the story and would ultimately reshape both of their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated during that first furious struggle in the doorway of the wedding chamber. With Enkidu now firmly established as Gilgamesh's closest companion, the restless energy that had once made him such a burden to his own people found a new outlet entirely, one that would soon carry both men far beyond the walls of Uruk and into danger neither of them had ever faced before. The decision to journey to the cedar forest. With Enkidu now settled into life within Uruk as Gilgamesh's closest companion, the king's restless nature soon began seeking out new challenges to occupy the tremendous energy that had once been directed so destructively toward his own subjects. Gilgamesh's attention eventually turned toward the distant cedar forest, a vast and legendary woodland understood to be under the protection of the gods themselves, home to trees of extraordinary size and value, and guarded by a fearsome creature known as Humbaba, a monstrous being appointed by the god Enlil specifically to protect the forest from anyone who might try to harvest its precious cedar or otherwise disturb its sacred boundaries. This fixation on cedar timber reflected a genuine and practical concern familiar to the real cities of ancient Mesopotamia, since the flat marshy plains surrounding Uruk and its neighbouring settlements produced very little usable timber of its own, forcing every Mesopotamian city to import quality wood from distant mountain regions, likely somewhere in the direction of the Amanus or Lebanon ranges, for anything from temple construction to shipbuilding, making the acquisition of cedar a matter of genuine economic and political significance rather than a purely fictional flourish invented for the sake of adventure. Gilgamesh proposed that the two of them travel together to this distant forest, confront Humbaba directly, and cut down the great cedar trees to bring back to Uruk, a mission driven partly by a desire to obtain the valuable timber, but driven even more strongly by Gilgamesh's own hunger for lasting fame and glory, a desire to accomplish something so remarkable that his name would be remembered long after his own life had ended. He spoke openly of his fear of death, acknowledging that all men eventually die and are forgotten, their bodies given over to the earth just as surely as any ordinary labourers, and expressing his determination to establish a name for himself, significant enough to outlast his own mortality, one that future generations might find carved somewhere and recognise even after everything else about him had faded from memory. Enkidu, however, reacted to this proposal with genuine alarm rather than enthusiasm, having encountered the cedar forest and its fearsome guardian during his own earlier years, living wild across the steppe. He described Humbaba in frightening detail, a creature whose roar was said to be like the rushing of a great flood, whose mouth was compared to fire itself, and whose very breath was said to bring death to anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in it. Enkidu warned Gilgamesh plainly that this was not an enemy to be taken lightly, and urged him to reconsider such a dangerous undertaking. Gilgamesh, however, remained undeterred by his companion's warnings, arguing that a man who accomplishes nothing significant during his life leaves behind no lasting legacy, while a man who dies attempting something truly great will at least be remembered for his courage, even if the attempt itself ultimately fails. This philosophy, built around the idea that fame and memory offered the only real form of immortality available to mortal men, would remain central to Gilgamesh's motivations throughout the entirety of the story that followed. Despite his own reservations, Enkidu ultimately agreed to accompany Gilgamesh on the journey, unwilling to let his friend face such tremendous danger alone, and the two of them began preparing in earnest for the expedition ahead. Uruk's own smiths were put to work fashioning weapons suited to the enormous strength of the two companions, axes weighing far more than any ordinary soldier could have swung, swords with blades wider and heavier than standard issue, and shields reinforced well beyond what a typical warrior might require, each piece forged specifically to withstand the kind of punishment the journey ahead was expected to demand of them. This preparation included having Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Ninsun, pray on their behalf to the sun, god Shamash, asking for his protection and guidance throughout the dangerous journey that lay before them, a request Shamash agreed to honor, taking a particular interest in seeing the two companions succeed in their perilous undertaking. The elders of Uruk, upon hearing of Gilgamesh's plans, expressed considerable concern of their own, gathering before him to warn the young king about the dangers of the forest and the terrible power of its guardian, reminding him that Humbabar's roar alone was said to be like the roar of a flood, and that his very footsteps could shake the ground for miles around. Several among the council spoke at length, recalling merchants and travellers who claimed to have glimpsed the edges of the forest and returned describing a place no sane man would willingly enter, urging Gilgamesh instead to content himself with the glory he had already earned as ruler of such a magnificent city, arguing that a king's first duty was to remain among his people rather than chase after distant dangers that offered no clear benefit to Uruk itself. They questioned why a king already blessed with youth and strength should risk everything on such a reckless undertaking, but ultimately offered their blessing for the journey once it became clear that Gilgamesh's mind was firmly set on proceeding regardless of any objections raised against it, entrusting Enkidu with the responsibility of watching over their king and bringing him home safely, since Enkidu, having lived in the wild himself, knew the paths and dangers of that distant region far better than anyone else remaining within the city walls. With preparations underway, Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Ninsun, climbed to the roof of her own dwelling, dressed herself in garments befitting her divine status, and offered incense and prayers directly to the sun god Shamash on her son's behalf, asking him plainly why he had given her son such a restless and unyielding heart, one that would not rest until it had driven him toward this dangerous, distant forest, and pleading with him nonetheless to watch over Gilgamesh throughout the journey and see him safely home again. Following this prayer, Ninsun offered specific requests on Enkidu's behalf as well, asking Shamash to instruct the winds themselves to fight alongside her sons when the time came, and to ensure that whatever dangers the forest presented, her adopted son would have every possible advantage available to him beyond his own considerable strength. She then performed a separate ritual formally adopting Enkidu as her own son alongside Gilgamesh, tying a protective amulet around his neck and charging him directly with the sacred duty of protecting his newfound brother throughout whatever dangers lay ahead of them both. The amulet itself was said to carry a blessing meant to ward off harm during the journey ahead, a small but meaningful gesture that formally welcomed Enkidu into Gilgamesh's own family, rather than leaving him simply as a companion picked up along the way, cementing a bond between the two men that now extended, at least symbolically, to include the goddess who had once given birth to a king and now claimed a second son, shaped instead from ordinary river clay. What awaited them in the distant forest would prove every bit as dangerous as Enkidu had warned, but the encounter with Humbaba would also reveal something far more complicated and morally troubling than either of them expected, a confrontation that raises uncomfortable questions the story itself never fully resolves. The journey and the battle with Humbaba. The journey toward the cedar forest stretched across a considerable distance, and along the way, Gilgamesh experienced a series of troubling dreams, each one interpreted by Enkidu as the two men made camp each night. In one dream, Gilgamesh saw a mountain collapsing directly on top of him, burying him beneath its weight. In another, he saw a wild bull pouring at the ground and stirring up thick clouds of dust before charging toward him, its horns catching the light of a sky already darkening with the threat of an approaching storm. In yet another, he witnessed the sky itself crying out, and the earth shaking violently, followed by darkness and a bolt of lightning that set everything ablaze, while a strange winged figure with the face of a lion pressed him down and offered him water. Though many of these dreams appeared frightening on their surface, involving collapsing mountains, thunderstorms, and other ominous imagery, Enkidu consistently interpreted them as favorable signs, reassuring Gilgamesh that despite their unsettling nature, these dreams actually pointed toward eventual success in their coming confrontation with Humbaba, explaining that the mountain represented Humbaba himself, destined to fall before them, and that the strange winged figure offering water was in fact the god Shamhat, promising his continued protection and favor throughout the confrontation ahead. Each morning after such a dream, Enkidu would sit beside his friend and walk through every detail methodically, asking Gilgamesh to describe exactly what he had seen and felt before offering his own reading of what it meant, a ritual the two of them repeated at nearly every stop along their journey, steadying Gilgamesh's resolve with each fresh interpretation, even as the dreams themselves grew increasingly strange and difficult to pass. Upon finally reaching the edge of the cedar forest, the two companions stood silent for a moment, taking in trees that towered far above anything either of them had ever encountered, their trunks wide enough that several men joining hands could not have circled them, their fragrance so strong that it was said to be detectable from a considerable distance before travellers ever laid eyes on the forest itself. Despite the blessing Ninsen had secured for them and the confidence both men had carried since setting out from Uruk, a genuine unease settled over them both as they crossed into Humbaba's territory for the first time, Gilgamesh reportedly trembling and Enkidu growing visibly pale, each man privately doubting, if only for a moment, whether their combined strength would truly prove sufficient against a guardian appointed directly by the gods. Monkeys called out from somewhere high in the canopy, birds sang in a constant chorus overhead, and the entire woodland seemed to hum with a kind of restless, watchful energy that made clear this ground did not belong to ordinary travellers. A path had been cleared long ago, its stones lying oddly undisturbed given how few visitors ever passed this way, leading directly toward the region Humbaba was known to patrol. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they eventually encountered Humbaba himself, and the confrontation that followed proved every bit as dangerous as Enkidu's earlier warnings had suggested. Humbaba possessed a set of terrifying attributes according to the story, including a face sometimes described as resembling a lion or as being formed from coiled intestines, a roar capable of causing the ground itself to tremble, and breath that could bring death or fire to anyone caught within its path, along with 7 layers of terrifying radiance or auras surrounding him, each one said to multiply his fearsome power considerably and to overwhelm the senses of anyone who dared approach him directly. Some accounts describe these 7 auras as functioning almost like a form of armour unto themselves, each one needing to be stripped away individually before Humbaba's actual body could be reached and harmed at all, meaning that much of the early stage of the confrontation involved Gilgamesh and Enkidu working to overcome this protective radiance before they could even begin inflicting any lasting damage against the guardian himself. Rather than the straightforward battle Gilgamesh had perhaps anticipated, the confrontation instead unfolded through a mixture of divine assistance, clever strategy, and a considerable amount of psychological maneuvering between the two sides. With the help of the sun god Shamhat, who sent 13 powerful winds to hamper Humbaba's movements and disorient him during the confrontation, including a whirlwind, a hurricane, a frost wind, and a sandstorm among others, pinning him in place and preventing him from bringing his full strength to bear against the two companions. Gilgamesh and Enkidu gradually gained the upper hand in the fight, closing the distance and striking at Humbaba, while he remained unable to properly defend himself against the combined assault of wind and blade. Shamhat's intervention proved decisive throughout the confrontation, since without the winds holding Humbaba in place, his sheer size and the terror radiating from his 7 auras might well have overwhelmed even 2 warriors as capable as Gilgamesh and Enkidu, a fact both men openly acknowledged once the fighting had ended, offering thanks to the god who had watched over them so closely throughout the entire ordeal. As Humbabar found himself increasingly overwhelmed and unable to effectively defend himself against the combined assault, he began pleading for his life, offering Gilgamesh all manner of concessions and promises in exchange for being spared. This is where the story takes an especially uncomfortable turn, one that ancient audiences may well have understood differently than modern readers tend to. Humbabar's pleading grew increasingly desperate and, in certain versions of the story, genuinely sympathetic, appealing directly to Gilgamesh's own sense of honor and mercy, offering to serve him as a woodcutter for the remainder of his days, to fell as many trees as Gilgamesh could ever want, and deliver them personally to whatever construction project the king wished, and even suggesting that Gilgamesh might gain more lasting benefit from keeping him alive as a servant than from killing him outright. Gilgamesh himself appeared genuinely torn by this plea, showing real hesitation about whether to proceed with the killing. It was Enkidu, somewhat surprisingly given his own earlier reluctance to even undertake this journey in the first place, who ultimately pushed for Humbabar's death rather than allowing him to be spared, warning Gilgamesh that sparing such a powerful guardian could bring consequences from the very gods who had appointed him to his role in the first place, and urging his friend to finish what they had started, rather than risk the wrath of Enlil, the god who had granted Humbabar his position as guardian of the forest. Enkidu argued further that word of any mercy shown toward Humbabar would inevitably reach the other gods regardless of their own wishes, and that leaving such a dangerous guardian alive, however diminished by their victory, risked leaving behind an enemy capable of eventually recovering his strength and taking revenge on Uruk itself at some later date, an argument that ultimately proved persuasive enough to overcome whatever hesitation Gilgamesh still carried in that moment. Persuaded by Enkidu's argument, Gilgamesh ultimately killed Humbabar, and the two companions proceeded to cut down a considerable number of the forest's great cedar trees, gathering the valuable timber to bring back with them to Uruk. Among these felled trees, Enkidu selected the single tallest cedar and fashioned from its wood an enormous door, intending it as an offering to the god Enlil, and the two men set this door adrift on a raft down the Euphrates, sending it toward the distant temple city of Nippur as tribute to the very god whose appointed guardian they had just killed, perhaps hoping to soften whatever divine anger their actions might otherwise provoke. This act, however satisfying it may have felt in the moment, would not go unnoticed or unpunished by the gods who had placed Humbabar in his position specifically to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion into the sacred forest, and the consequences of this decision would eventually come to weigh heavily on both men, though not before an even more dramatic confrontation unfolded first, one involving a goddess whose romantic interest in Gilgamesh would prove every bit as dangerous as anything the two companions had faced in the cedar forest. Ishtar's proposal and the bull of heaven. Following their victorious return from the cedar forest, Gilgamesh's reputation and confidence had grown considerably, and this newfound glory attracted the attention of Ishtar, the powerful goddess of love, fertility, and war, whose great temple, known as the Eana, stood at the very heart of Uruk itself and formed one of the city's most sacred and important structures, served by priestesses who conducted rituals in her honor throughout the year. According to the account, Gilgamesh had just finished washing away the grime of battle, combing out his long hair and dressing himself in fine royal garments and a crown, restoring the radiant kingly appearance that had first drawn attention to him at the very beginning of the story, when Ishtar caught sight of him and found herself overcome with desire. Ishtar found herself drawn to Gilgamesh's extraordinary strength, beauty, and recent accomplishments, and approached him directly, proposing marriage and offering him a considerable array of gifts and blessings in exchange for his affection, including a magnificent chariot with wheels of gold and horns of amber, tribute from foreign kings, and abundant prosperity for his entire kingdom should he agree to become her husband. Rather than accepting this remarkable offer, however, Gilgamesh responded with a blunt and thoroughly insulting refusal. He paused only briefly before answering her, weighing the considerable wealth and prestige such a marriage might bring against everything he had heard whispered about the goddess's history with former companions, and decided the risk was simply not one worth taking, regardless of how tempting her offer might otherwise have appeared. He then began cataloguing in considerable detail the fates of Ishtar's previous lovers, each of whom, according to Gilgamesh's account, had suffered greatly or met a terrible end as a direct result of the goddess's affections. He began with Tammuz, the husband of her youth, for whom Gilgamesh reminded her she had decreed endless mourning and wailing year after year, a tradition of ritual grief still practiced by her own worshippers each season in his memory. He described a colourful bird she had once loved before breaking its wing so that it could no longer fly and was left calling out weakly among the trees, unable ever again to join its own kind in flight. He spoke of a lion she had loved before digging 7 pits to trap him, watching him struggle and eventually perish in the very trap she herself had prepared. He described a magnificent horse she had loved before condemning it to a life of relentless goading with whip and spur, and a bit that tore constantly at its mouth, forced into exhausting labour that left it perpetually thirsty. Its own mother denied the chance to see it thrive. He described a shepherd she had once loved before transforming him into a wolf, hunted afterward by his own herding dogs, and even by his own younger brothers, who no longer recognized him, forced to flee into the hills where he had once tended his flocks in peace. And finally he described Ishulanu, her own father's gardener, a man who had once brought her baskets of dates and refused her advances out of loyalty to his own position, only to be turned into a frog, or, in some tellings, a mole for his refusal, condemned to a shrunken and miserable existence for daring to say no to her, forced to burrow through the very soil he had once tended so carefully by hand. Gilgamesh made clear that he had no intention of becoming yet another name added to this troubling list, and rejected her proposal outright and without any diplomatic softening whatsoever. Enkidu, standing nearby throughout this exchange, made no attempt to restrain his friend or soften the blow, and by several accounts seemed to take a certain satisfaction in watching his companion dismantle the goddess's proposal so thoroughly, having little patience himself for divine figures who expected mortals to simply accept whatever attention they chose to offer, regardless of the risk involved. Ishtar, humiliated and enraged by this public rejection, stormed directly to her father Anu, the elderly god of the sky and the nominal head of the entire pantheon, a figure who by this stage of Mesopotamian tradition tended to preside over the affairs of the other gods more as a distant authority than as an active participant in earthly matters, demanding that he grant her the use of the Bull of Heaven, a massive and destructive creature capable of causing catastrophic devastation, so that she could unleash it upon Gilgamesh as punishment for the insult he had just delivered against her. The Bull of Heaven itself was understood within Mesopotamian tradition as a celestial creature associated with the constellation later recognized elsewhere as Taurus, its presence in the sky ordinarily governing matters of agriculture and the changing seasons rather than serving as an instrument of vengeance, making its unusual deployment against a single mortal king all the more extraordinary an escalation on Ishtar's part. Anu initially hesitated, warning his daughter that releasing such a creature would bring severe consequences, including years of famine and hardship for the people of Uruk who would bear the brunt of the destruction, since the Bull of Heaven's arrival was known throughout Mesopotamian tradition to strip the land bare and leave 7 years of scarcity trailing behind it wherever it roamed. Ishtar threatened dire consequences of her own if her request were refused, warning her father that she would smash open the very gates of the underworld and release its dead upon the living world if he continued to deny her, a threat severe enough that Anu ultimately relented, granting her the bull of heaven to use as she saw fit. The bull of heaven descended upon Uruk with devastating force, and its rampage proved every bit as destructive as Anu had originally feared. According to the account, the bull's initial snort alone was powerful enough to create a massive chasm in the earth, one large enough to swallow a considerable number of the city's own men whole, 100 or more falling into the opening with its very first breath. Market stalls overturned, livestock scattered in every direction, and mothers pulled children indoors as word spread through the streets that something enormous had descended upon the city from the sky itself. Priestesses at the temple of Ishtar were said to have hidden themselves within the innermost chambers, uncertain whether their own goddess intended the destruction as punishment for some failing of their own, rather than as an act of revenge against the king alone. Its continued attacks tore through the city and the surrounding countryside, killing hundreds more as it rampaged uncontrolled through streets and fields alike, trampling crops and shattering buildings, the very ground shaking under the force of its charges as terrified citizens scrambled for whatever shelter they could find. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, working together with the same coordinated strength and courage that had already carried them through their confrontation with Humbaba, moved to confront the beast directly. Enkidu managed to seize the bull from behind, grabbing hold of its tail and horns to hold it steady and expose its vulnerable points, wrestling against a creature many times his own weight, while dust and debris churned around them both, while Gilgamesh drove his sword deep into the creature, delivering the killing blow that finally brought the rampage to an end, the bull collapsing amid a great cloud of dust as the surrounding crowd, watching from whatever safe distance they could manage, erupted in stunned relief. Rather than showing any measure of restraint or respect following this victory, Enkidu compounded the insult against Ishtar considerably further, tearing off one of the bull's hind legs and hurling it directly at the goddess as she watched the confrontation unfold from atop the city walls, accompanied by a series of taunting remarks suggesting that, had he been able to catch her as easily as he had caught the bull, he would have treated her in exactly the same fashion. Ishtar, along with a gathering of her temple attendants, responded to this fresh humiliation with considerable outrage and mourning over the loss of the bull, while the people of Uruk, by stark contrast, celebrated the victory of their king and his companion, holding a great feast to honor the pair for having saved the city from the creature's devastating rampage. Gilgamesh, in the aftermath of the celebration, took the bull's enormous horns and had them fashioned into containers capable of holding a considerable quantity of oil, presenting them afterward within his own palace as an offering to his father Lugalbanda, mounting them prominently as a lasting record of the victory the two companions had achieved together against a creature sent directly from the heavens themselves. This celebration, however, would prove tragically short-lived, the gods having witnessed the killing of both Humbaba and now the bull of heaven within a relatively short span of time, began deliberating over an appropriate response to these repeated affronts against divine authority, and the judgment they eventually reached would strike at the very heart of the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, setting in motion the most devastating turn the story has to offer. The death of Enkidu. In the aftermath of Humbaba's death and the destruction of the bull of heaven, the assembled gods convened to determine how to properly address these repeated transgressions against divine order. Though both Gilgamesh and Enkidu had participated equally in both acts, the gods ultimately decided that only one of the two companions would bear the punishment, and after some deliberation among themselves, they determined that Enkidu, rather than Gilgamesh, would be the one to die as a consequence of everything that had happened. Shamhat, who had aided the two companions so directly during their confrontation with Humbaba, spoke up in the assembly on Enkidu's behalf, arguing that neither killing had taken place without just cause, since Humbaba had been a genuine threat, and the bull of heaven had already claimed hundreds of lives before it was finally stopped. Despite this defense, the other gods remained unmoved, and the verdict against Enkidu stood regardless of Shamash's objections. This decision struck Enkidu with immediate and profound dread once it was revealed to him through a troubling dream, one in which he witnessed a fearsome, winged creature with the talons of an eagle, its face darkened and its body covered in feathers, seizing him and dragging him down into the underworld. A dark and dust-filled place the story describes in considerably bleak terms, where the dead are said to sit in permanent darkness, clothed like birds with feathers, eating clay and dust for sustenance, entirely without light or comfort of any kind, ruled over by a queen named Ereshkigal, who kept a record of the arriving dead and the officials who served beneath her, watching in silence as each newly deceased soul was brought before her one by one. This vision of the afterlife awaiting him filled Enkidu with genuine terror, and shortly after experiencing this dream, he fell seriously ill, his physical condition beginning a steady and painful decline that both he and Gilgamesh understood to be the fulfillment of the god's judgment against him. Each morning brought fresh weakness, his once powerful frame growing thinner and less capable with every passing day, fevers taking hold of him at night and leaving him drenched and shaking by dawn. Gilgamesh summoned every healer within his kingdom, offering vast rewards to anyone capable of reversing what was happening to his friend. But each physician who examined Enkidu departed with the same grim assessment that this was no ordinary sickness capable of being treated with herbs or ritual, but a fate decreed directly by the gods themselves, beyond the reach of any mortal remedy. Word of Enkidu's illness spread through Uruk, and the people who had once feared the wild stranger blocking their king's path now found themselves genuinely grieving his suffering, gathering outside the palace to offer prayers on his behalf, remembering the destruction of the bull of heaven and the relief his strength had brought them during that terrifying rampage. As his illness progressed and his death drew nearer, Enkidu experienced a considerable range of emotional turmoil, initially directing bitter curses toward those he believed responsible for bringing him into civilization in the first place, particularly the trapper who had first sought out Shamhat, wishing that his fields would remain barren and that wild animals would forever destroy whatever traps he attempted to set, and Shamhat herself, blaming her for pulling him away from his simpler, wilder existence and cursing her to a future filled with degradation, wandering the streets without a proper home, drinking the dregs left behind by others, and being cast aside by drunkards in the very shadow of the city wall, setting him on a path that had ultimately led him toward this painful and premature death. He recalled every detail of how his old life among the gazelles had been disrupted by that single encounter at the watering hole, wishing upon the trapper a life of poverty and failure, unable ever again to provide properly for himself through the trade that had once sustained him so reliably. He cursed the very door of the temple he had once struggled with in his first fight against Gilgamesh, wishing he had instead used its wood for some purpose that would have benefited him rather than trapping him in this fate, and railed against the seemingly cruel unfairness of dying as a direct consequence of choices that had once felt like they were opening up an entirely richer and more meaningful existence for him. Enkidu spoke of that very doorway with particular bitterness, recalling how its wood had felt beneath his hands during that first violent struggle, wishing aloud that he had simply cut it down for firewood rather than ever setting foot near it, as though blaming the door itself might somehow lessen the weight of everything that had followed from that single encounter. However, the god Shamash, hearing these bitter curses, intervened to remind Enkidu of everything his transformation into civilized life had actually given him, the deep friendship and love he had come to share with Gilgamesh, the adventures and glory the two of them had experienced together, and the profound richness of an existence he never would have known had he remained purely wild and isolated out on the open steppe. Moved by this reminder, Enkidu's bitterness softened considerably, and he redirected his earlier curses into blessings instead, particularly towards Shamhat, wishing her prosperity and honor rather than continuing to hold her responsible for the painful fate now closing in around him, declaring that governors and noblemen would come to love her, that she would be dressed in fine garments befitting a woman of considerable standing, and that priests and temple officials would welcome her into their company rather than treating her with the scorn his earlier curses had wished upon her. As Enkidu's illness continued its inevitable progression, Gilgamesh remained constantly at his side, watching helplessly as his closest companion grew weaker with each passing day. Enkidu described his growing fear and grief to Gilgamesh directly, mourning the fact that he would not die in glorious battle as he might once have imagined for someone of his strength, but would instead waste away slowly from illness, a death he considered far less honourable than the kind of dramatic end a warrior of his calibre might otherwise have hoped for. Gilgamesh remained at his friend's side throughout this decline, refusing to leave him even briefly, listening as Enkidu recounted memories from their journeys together, the defeat of Humbaba, the destruction of the Bull of Heaven, and the years of companionship that had followed that first violent meeting in the doorway of the wedding chamber, each memory offered as though Enkidu were trying to hold on to some proof that his life, however it was ending, had genuinely mattered. In the final hours before his death, Enkidu grew quiet, his earlier restlessness giving way to a kind of resigned calm, and he spoke to Gilgamesh in a voice grown faint, expressing gratitude for the years they had shared together, despite everything that illness had now taken from him, and asking his friend to remember him not for the manner of his death, but for everything the two of them had accomplished side by side since that first violent afternoon in the doorway of the wedding chamber. Eventually, after a prolonged and painful decline, lasting a number of days, Enkidu died, leaving Gilgamesh utterly devastated by the loss of the friend who had so thoroughly transformed his own life and character since that first violent encounter in the doorway of the wedding chamber years earlier. Gilgamesh's grief poured out in an extended and deeply emotional lament, in which he called upon the mountains, the forests, the rivers, and even the wild animals of the steppe to join him in mourning his companion's death, refusing at first to allow Enkidu's body to be buried, holding on to him for several days until the natural process of decay finally forced him to accept that his friend was truly and permanently gone. He tore at his own fine garments in the days following the death, casting aside the very robes and jewellery that marked him as king, and wandered the halls of his own palace calling out his friend's name as though sheer repetition might somehow summon him back, refusing food offered by his own attendants, and sitting for long stretches beside the body in complete silence before the grief would overtake him once again. Once burial could no longer be delayed, Gilgamesh commissioned a statue of Enkidu, ordering it fashioned from gold, lapis lazuli, and other precious materials, and set about gathering every kind of treasure his kingdom possessed, from carnelian bowls filled with honey to alabaster jars filled with cream, presenting these offerings before the gods of the underworld in hopes of easing whatever path now lay ahead of his departed friend. He summoned craftsmen, smiths, stoneworkers, and jewellers from across his kingdom, and instructed them all to fashion likenesses and tributes to Enkidu's memory, weeping openly before each of them as he described the qualities of the man they were meant to honour. This devastating loss marked a profound turning point in Gilgamesh's own character and outlook on life, awakening within him a deep and consuming fear of his own eventual mortality, one that would drive him to abandon his kingdom entirely and set out on a desperate, sprawling journey in search of a way to escape the very fate that had just claimed the person he loved most in the entire world. Gilgamesh's grief and the journey begins. Enkidu's death left Gilgamesh utterly transformed, consumed by a grief so profound that it fundamentally altered his entire relationship with his own mortality. Where he had once sought glory and lasting fame as his answer to the inevitability of death, watching his closest friend actually die before his eyes stripped away any comfort that pursuit of fame had previously offered him. he became consumed instead with an urgent, desperate need to find some way of avoiding death altogether, a preoccupation that soon overtook every other concern in his life. Abandoning the comforts and responsibilities of his kingship in Uruk, Gilgamesh set out into the wilderness, his appearance and behavior growing increasingly wild and unkempt as his journey progressed, wearing animal skins rather than royal garments, and wandering without any clear destination beyond a single driving purpose, to find Utnapishtim, a legendary figure said to be the only mortal ever granted immortality by the gods, believing that if anyone possessed knowledge of how to escape death, it would be this singular exception to the universal rule governing every other human life. Those who encountered Gilgamesh during this stretch of his journey often failed to recognize him as the once magnificent king of Uruk at all. His hair matted and overgrown, his face gaunt from irregular meals and restless travel, his once fine robes long since discarded in favor of whatever rough hides he could gather along the way. He carried himself now with the desperate urgency of a man chasing something just beyond his reach, driven forward by grief rather than by any of the glory or ambition that had once defined him. Gilgamesh's journey carried him to the edges of the known world, eventually bringing him to a pair of enormous mountains called Mashu, said to guard the point where the sun itself rose and set each day, their peaks reaching up toward the very vault of the heavens and their roots extending down into the underworld itself, forming a boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it. Along the way, before ever reaching these twin mountains, Gilgamesh was said to have encountered lions prowling the passes he travelled through, and rather than avoiding them, he confronted and killed a number of these creatures, using their hides afterward for warmth during the cold stretches of his journey. A small but telling reminder that even stripped of his royal comforts, the raw physical power that had once made him such a formidable king had not abandoned him entirely. The entrance to these mountains was guarded by a pair of terrifying scorpion beings, a male and a female, their bodies part human and part venomous creature, whose mere gaze was said to bring death to anyone unworthy of passing through the gate they protected, their glare alone described as capable of felling mountains. Despite his understandable fear upon encountering these formidable guardians, so overwhelmed that he reportedly covered his own face at the terrifying sight of them, Gilgamesh approached them directly, and the scorpion beings, recognizing something of the divine heritage present within him, noting that though he was 2/3 god, flesh of the gods was in his body, chose not to destroy him outright, instead questioning him about his purpose and the reason for his desperate journey. Gilgamesh answered their questions plainly, describing without any attempt at flattery or exaggeration the death of Enkidu, the depth of his own grief, and his fear of one day suffering the same fate himself, speaking with an honesty that seemed to move the scorpion guardians despite their own fearsome nature. Gilgamesh explained his quest to find Utnapishtim and learn the secret of eternal life, and the scorpion guardians, though skeptical that any mortal had ever successfully made this particular journey before him, telling him plainly that no man born of woman had ever accomplished what he now proposed to attempt, ultimately agreed to allow him passage through the mountain, warning him of the tremendous darkness and danger that awaited him along the path ahead. The passage through the mountain proved to be an ordeal unlike anything Gilgamesh had yet faced, a tunnel of complete and total darkness stretching for what the story describes as a distance of many leagues, requiring him to travel continuously through the blackness for hour after hour without any light to guide his way, feeling nothing around him but darkness pressing in from every direction. He measured the passage of time only by his own laboured breathing and the ache building steadily in his legs, unable to see even his own hand held directly before his face, stumbling forward blindly through narrow passages that occasionally widened enough to let him quicken his pace before closing in again around him. Racing against the returning light of dawn that would supposedly bring certain death to anyone still caught within the tunnel When the sun itself began its own daily journey through that same passage, Gilgamesh pressed onward through the darkness with desperate urgency, counting off each hour as it passed in his mind, and just as exhaustion and despair began to overwhelm him entirely, he emerged at last, with the very first light of dawn breaking behind him, into a garden of extraordinary and startling beauty on the other side. This garden, containing trees bearing jewels rather than ordinary fruit, their branches heavy with carnelian clusters and lapis lazuli foliage, catching and reflecting light in a way that must have seemed almost impossibly beautiful after the crushing darkness of the tunnel he had just endured, offered Gilgamesh only a brief moment of wonder and respite before his journey continued onward, driven still by his singular, unrelenting purpose. He walked slowly among the strange trees for a time, reaching out once or twice to touch a branch heavy with polished stone fruit, marveling at a beauty entirely unlike anything found in the ordinary orchards of Uruk, before forcing himself onward, unwilling to let even a sight this remarkable delay him any longer than necessary from the task that had brought him this far. Beyond this jeweled garden, Gilgamesh's path would soon bring him into contact with several more figures who would each, in their own way, attempt to redirect him away from his desperate quest, offering him different perspectives on mortality and the proper way for a mortal man to spend the limited time available to him, wisdom that Gilgamesh, in his grief-stricken determination, initially found himself unwilling or unable to fully accept. Siduri, Urshanabi, and the waters of death. Continuing beyond the jeweled garden, Gilgamesh eventually arrived at the dwelling of Siduri, a divine tavern keeper who lived near the shore of a vast sea, her home positioned along the very edge of the known world. A small building with a golden vat and golden fermenting mash set up for the brewing of beer. A solitary outpost of ordinary comfort standing at the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond it. Upon first catching sight of Gilgamesh's wild, unkempt appearance, his face gaunt and weathered from his prolonged journey, and his body draped in the skins of animals rather than any proper clothing, Siduri initially mistook him for a dangerous wanderer, or even a murderer fleeing from some crime, and barred her door against him out of understandable caution, watching him warily through a small opening before deciding whether to speak with him at all. Once Gilgamesh managed to explain who he truly was and the desperate circumstances that had brought him to her doorstep, describing the death of his beloved friend Enkidu and his own subsequent all-consuming fear of death, Siduri offered him a considerable measure of comfort and practical wisdom, though not at all the answer Gilgamesh had been hoping to hear. She gently explained to him that the gods, when they created humanity, had reserved the gift of immortality for themselves alone, allotting death as the inevitable and unavoidable fate awaiting every mortal being without exception. She told him that he would never find the eternal life he sought, since it was simply not something granted to beings of his kind, no matter how strong or how favoured by the gods he might otherwise be. Rather than continuing his desperate and likely futile search for a way to escape this fundamental truth, Siduri counselled him instead to return home, to embrace the simple pleasures still available to him during whatever time remained in his own mortal life, filling his belly with good things each day, dancing and making merry both day and night, wearing clean and freshly laundered garments, washing his head and bathing regularly in water, cherishing the small child who might hold his hand, and delighting in the companionship of a beloved wife within his embrace. Since these ordinary, everyday joys, she explained, were the true and proper business of every mortal life, rather than the impossible pursuit of something never meant to belong to him. This advice, though wise and gently delivered, failed to satisfy Gilgamesh's grief-driven determination, and he pressed Siduri further for information about how he might actually reach Utnapishtim, refusing to abandon his quest despite her counsel. Siduri warned him plainly that no one had ever crossed the sea before him, that even Shamash himself, the sun god, crossed those same waters only in the course of his daily journey across the sky, finding no rest anywhere upon them, and that the crossing Gilgamesh proposed to attempt was difficult in the extreme, its waters treacherous beyond anything he had yet encountered on his journey. Recognizing that he would not be dissuaded, Siduri eventually relented and directed him toward Urshanabi, a ferryman capable of navigating the treacherous waters that lay between the ordinary world and the distant location where Utnapishtim was said to reside. Locating Urshanabi, Gilgamesh initially encountered a complication that nearly derailed his journey entirely. Urshanabi himself had served in this role for longer than anyone could clearly recall, ferrying the rare traveller capable of reaching this distant shore back and forth across the deadly waters, using methods passed down to him through his own long apprenticeship in the role, methods that depended entirely on the very stone figures Gilgamesh had just destroyed without understanding their true purpose. In a fit of frustration, or perhaps simple exhaustion, he had smashed apart a set of mysterious stone figures, sometimes described as beings carved from stone, who assisted Urshanabi in his work, that the ferryman relied upon to safely navigate the specific and extraordinarily dangerous waters they would need to cross. Waters known as the Waters of Death, a sea so lethal that even the smallest physical contact with it was said to bring instant destruction to anyone unfortunate enough to touch it directly. Urshanabi, surveying the wreckage Gilgamesh had left behind, expressed genuine dismay at what had just been destroyed, explaining that these stone figures had been essential to crossing safely, and that without them, the usual method of propulsion was now closed off entirely. With these essential navigational aids now destroyed, Urshanabi instructed Gilgamesh to venture into the nearby forest and cut a substantial number of long wooden punting poles instead, 300 of them by the reckoning given in the story, explaining that these poles could serve as an alternative method of propelling the boat across the deadly waters, provided each pole was used only once and immediately discarded the moment Gilgamesh's hand came anywhere near contact with the lethal sea itself, since even a single touch of that water meant certain death regardless of a person's strength or divine heritage. Gilgamesh set about the task at once, felling tree after tree and trimming each trunk down into a suitable length, gathering the enormous supply Urshanabi had requested before the two of them finally pushed off from shore. The labour consumed the better part of a day, sweat soaking through the animal skins he still wore from his long wandering, blisters forming across palms already hardened by years of combat, but unaccustomed to the particular strain of repeated cutting and trimming, yet he pressed on without complaint, understanding that every pole represented one more safe stretch of passage across waters capable of ending his journey, permanently should he falter even once. Following these careful instructions, Gilgamesh successfully assisted Urshanabi in navigating the boat across the perilous waters, using each pole exactly once before discarding it and reaching for the next, until, with the poles finally exhausted, Gilgamesh had to improvise a final method of propulsion, using his own clothing as a makeshift sail to carry the boat the remaining distance, carefully avoiding any direct contact with the deadly water throughout this final tense stretch of the crossing. The surface of the Waters of Death appeared, by most descriptions, almost indistinguishable from ordinary seawater, calm and unremarkable to look upon, which made the constant vigilance required of both men all the more exhausting, each aware that a single careless motion, a slip of the hand or an ill-timed gust, catching the boat off balance, could end the journey permanently for either of them. Having successfully navigated this treacherous passage, Gilgamesh finally arrived at the distant shore where Utnapishtim made his home, the very figure Gilgamesh had travelled so far and endured so much in order to finally meet face to face, carrying with him every hope that this singular, immortal survivor of an ancient catastrophe might hold the answer he had been so desperately seeking since the moment his beloved friend Enkidu had first drawn his final breath. Utnapishtim, observing the ragged, travel-worn figure approaching from across the water, noted aloud that Gilgamesh's face bore none of the calm that should belong to someone of his heritage, remarking that his cheeks were hollowed by grief, and his heart weighed down by wandering, and asking directly why he had come so far and endured such hardship to reach a shore few mortals had ever set eyes upon. Meeting Utnapishtim and the flood story. Upon finally arriving before Utnapishtim, Gilgamesh poured out the full story of his grief and his desperate quest, explaining in considerable detail the death of Enkidu and his own subsequent fear of mortality, and directly asking Utnapishtim to reveal whatever secret had allowed him alone, among all mortal men, to achieve the gift of eternal life that the gods otherwise reserved exclusively for themselves. He spoke at length of the fight against the Bull of Heaven, of Humbabar's forest, and of the long agonizing decline that had finally taken Enkidu from him, describing how his friend's face had changed in those final days, how the strength that had once matched his own had wasted away entirely, leaving him with nothing but memory and an unbearable dread of one day facing the very same fate himself. Utnapishtim's response began not with a simple secret or a formula Gilgamesh might easily replicate, but with an extended account of an extraordinary catastrophe from the distant past, one that would eventually explain the truly unique and unrepeatable circumstances under which he had originally received his own immortality. Utnapishtim's own name, meaning something close to he found life, marked him as the sole survivor of a catastrophe old enough that even by the time the standard Babylonian version of the epic was composed, his story had already been circulating for many centuries under an earlier name, Ziusudra, within older Sumerian poems dedicated specifically to the flood and its aftermath, poems that predate the version incorporated into Gilgamesh's own journey by a considerable stretch of time. Long ago, Utnapishtim explained, the gods had grown weary and irritated by the constant noise and disturbance created by the ever-growing human population, their endless activity and clamour disrupting the peace the gods otherwise wished to enjoy. Enlil in particular found himself unable to sleep amid the ceaseless commotion rising up from human settlements below, and brought his complaint before the assembly of gods repeatedly, growing increasingly convinced that some drastic measure would be required to finally silence the disturbance. In response to this irritation, the gods, led by Enlil, decided collectively to send a great flood that would wipe out humanity entirely, cleansing the world of the disturbance human civilization had created. However, the god Ea, who held a particular fondness for humanity, despite the broader divine consensus favouring their destruction, secretly warned Utnapishtim of the coming catastrophe, careful to avoid directly violating the other god's decree by speaking his warning not to Utnapishtim himself directly, but to the reed wall of his house, addressing the wall as though it alone were his intended listener, knowing full well that Utnapishtim would overhear the warning regardless of this technical distinction, a clever workaround that allowed Ea to claim, if ever questioned by the other gods, that he had not personally informed any mortal of their coming plan. Ea instructed Utnapishtim to tear down his own house and use the material to construct an enormous boat, providing him with detailed specifications for its construction, describing a vessel built in the shape of a perfect cube, its length, width, and height all measured equally, divided internally into 7 levels with 9 separate compartments on each level, and sealed thoroughly both inside and out with considerable quantities of pitch and bitumen to ensure not even the smallest amount of water could seep through its hull. Utnapishtim was also instructed to bring aboard his own family, along with a variety of animals and skilled craftsmen from every trade, in order to preserve as much of life and knowledge as possible against the coming devastation. Utnapishtim followed these instructions with considerable urgency, constructing the enormous vessel over the course of several days, describing an exhausting effort that consumed enormous quantities of pitch and oil and required the labour of the very craftsmen who would eventually be saved aboard it. His own children joined in the effort as well, hauling materials and helping seal every joint and seam against the coming water, working alongside their father from dawn until well past dark, despite having little real understanding of just how severe the coming catastrophe would actually prove to be, trusting entirely in Utnapishtim's own conviction that the strange warning he had received was genuine and worth this tremendous effort. He then sealed it thoroughly to ensure it remained watertight against the coming deluge, loading it with his family, his craftsmen, and a wide variety of animals in the manner Ea had instructed, before sealing the entrance behind him, just as the very first signs of the coming storm began to appear on the horizon. The animals brought aboard included both the wild creatures of the field and the domesticated beasts of ordinary households, gathered together indiscriminately according to the account, every kind of living creature loaded on alongside the family and craftsmen Utnapishtim had assembled. As the very first dark clouds gathered on the horizon, Utnapishtim recalled feeling a mixture of dread and disbelief, even after everything Ea had told him, watching the sky change colour in a manner he had never witnessed in all his years, and hurrying his family aboard with a growing sense that whatever was coming would prove far worse than even the god's warning had prepared him to expect. When the flood finally arrived, it proved to be an utterly catastrophic and overwhelming event, described in the story as being so severe that even the gods themselves grew frightened and horrified by the sheer scale of destruction they had unleashed, with several of the gods reportedly withdrawing in distress to the highest heavens, cowering there like frightened dogs pressed against a wall, disturbed by the enormity of what they had set into motion. The goddess Ishtar in particular was said to have cried out in anguish at the sight of her own creation, humanity itself, being wiped away before her eyes, weeping and expressing considerable regret over the suffering their collective decision had caused to the very people she and the other gods had once helped bring into existence, wishing aloud that she had never consented to the plan in the first place. The storm and flooding continued for 6 full days and nights, an overwhelming deluge that submerged the entire known world beneath its waters and destroyed everything that had once existed upon dry land, the south wind blowing without pause, submerging the mountains themselves and catching all of humanity like fish struggling beneath the surface. Brother no longer able to see brother through the driving rain and darkness, the entire world reduced to a single unbroken expanse of churning water. On the 7th day, the storm finally began to subside, the sea growing calm, the flood itself stilling at last, and Utnapishtim's boat eventually came to rest upon the peak of a mountain called Nimush, which emerged as the floodwaters gradually began to recede across the devastated landscape below, the boat remaining lodged firmly against the mountainside for 6 additional days while the water continued its slow retreat. To determine whether dry land had truly reappeared elsewhere in the wider world, Utnapishtim released a series of birds from the boat, first a dove, which found nowhere suitable to land and returned to the boat, and then a swallow, which likewise found no place to rest and also returned. Finally, he released a raven, which upon finding dry land and sources of food available to it, did not return to the boat at all, confirming to Utnapishtim that the floodwaters had receded sufficiently for him and his family to finally disembark and begin rebuilding their lives upon the newly emerged earth. Utnapishtim then opened every window and door of the great vessel, releasing the animals in every direction across the 4 winds, and offering thanks for having survived an ordeal that had claimed every other living thing across the surface of the earth. He climbed to the peak of the mountain where his boat remained lodged and set up an altar there, arranging reeds, cedar, and myrtle beneath a vessel meant to hold his offering, preparing to give thanks to the very gods who, only days earlier, had been prepared to see him and his entire family perish, along with the rest of humanity. Following his survival of this catastrophic flood, Utnapishtim offered a grateful sacrifice to the gods, and the gods, drawn by the sweet savour of the offering rising up from the mountain, gathered around it like flies. Once the matter of Enlil's anger had finally been settled, the gods granted Utnapishtim and his wife a permanent dwelling place at what the story describes as the mouth of the rivers, a remote and distant location set apart from the world of ordinary mortals, where the two of them would live out eternity together, visited only rarely by anyone from the world they had once belonged to, their old life among mortal humanity left behind entirely the moment the gods elevated them to their new, unending existence. Enlil, upon discovering that a mortal family had survived his decree of total destruction, initially reacted with considerable anger, storming forward and demanding to know how any human being could possibly have escaped his judgment, believing his intended purpose had been directly and deliberately thwarted. However, Ea intervened once again, arguing that indiscriminately destroying all of humanity for the transgressions of the many had been an excessive and poorly considered response in the first place, suggesting that more measured punishments, a lion, a famine, a plague, might have addressed the gods' grievances without erasing humanity from the world entirely, and persuading Enlil to reconsider his anger. Ultimately, rather than punishing Utnapishtim and his wife further, Enlil instead granted the two of them the extraordinary gift of immortality, elevating them to a status resembling that of the gods themselves, and placing them at the very distant edge of the world, where Gilgamesh had now finally managed to locate them. Having recounted this entire extraordinary story, Utnapishtim made a crucial point that Gilgamesh needed to fully understand, that the circumstances surrounding his own immortality had been entirely unique and could never be repeated or replicated for any other mortal being, no matter how strong, how determined, or how deserving that person might otherwise seem. He spoke plainly and without any cruelty in his tone, explaining that the assembly of gods had gathered only once for this particular purpose, and that no such gathering would ever convene again on behalf of any other mortal, regardless of how impressive their deeds or how sincere their grief. There was no formula or ritual Gilgamesh could follow to achieve the same outcome, since Utnapishtim's immortality had come about only through an extraordinary, unrepeatable set of circumstances tied to that singular, ancient catastrophe. Despite this discouraging clarification, Utnapishtim decided to offer Gilgamesh one final test regardless, a challenge that would ultimately reveal something important about Gilgamesh's own limitations, and set the stage for one final bittersweet opportunity at something resembling the answer he had travelled so desperately far to find. The test of sleep and the plant of youth. Utnapishtim proposed a direct challenge to Gilgamesh, suggesting that if he truly wished to overcome death, he ought to first demonstrate his ability to overcome something far simpler, the ordinary need for sleep, by remaining continuously awake for a period of 6 days and 7 nights. He explained his reasoning plainly, that a man who could not master the basic rhythms of his own body, the simple pull of exhaustion after a long journey, stood little chance of mastering something as vast and permanent as death itself, and that this smaller test would offer a clear and undeniable measure of whether Gilgamesh's ambitions matched his actual capabilities. Gilgamesh, exhausted already from his tremendously long and difficult journey to reach this distant location, agreed to attempt the challenge, sitting down as instructed to begin his test of endurance. He settled himself cross-legged upon the ground before Utnapishtim, determined and confident despite the weariness etched across his own face, insisting that a man who had crossed the waters of death and survived the darkness beneath the twin mountains would surely have no trouble outlasting a mere week without sleep. However, almost immediately upon sitting still, the accumulated exhaustion of his entire journey overtook him, and he fell into a deep sleep almost the very moment the challenge officially began, entirely unaware that he had failed the test in the most immediate and complete way possible. Utnapishtim, observing this immediate and total failure, instructed his wife to bake a loaf of bread for each day that Gilgamesh remained asleep, marking each one somehow so they could be told apart later, and placing them in a row beside him so that upon waking he would have undeniable physical proof of exactly how long he had actually slept, since Gilgamesh, still in denial about having failed at all, would likely insist upon waking that he had only just barely begun to doze off moments earlier. Utnapishtim's wife carried out this task faithfully over the following week, setting a fresh loaf down each morning beside the sleeping king, watching the earlier loaves grow increasingly hard, mouldy, and crumbling with each passing day, while Gilgamesh himself remained entirely motionless and unaware, lost in a sleep so deep that nothing around him seemed to register at all. Gilgamesh slept continuously for the entire 7-day period, and when he finally did wake, he initially insisted, exactly as anticipated, that he had barely closed his eyes for even a brief moment. He rubbed at his face and looked around at Utnapishtim with visible confusion, insisting that he had only just sat down and that sleep had barely touched him at all, growing defensive when Utnapishtim gently suggested otherwise, unwilling at first to accept that an entire week had somehow slipped past him without his awareness. Utnapishtim then directed his attention to the row of bread loaves lying beside him, each one in a different and increasingly advanced state of staleness and decay, providing undeniable, visible proof of just how many days had actually passed while he lay there sleeping, a humbling and humiliating confirmation of his own very human limitations. Confronted with this undeniable evidence of his failure, Gilgamesh was forced to accept that his quest for immortality itself, having failed even this comparatively minor test, involving nothing more demanding than ordinary sleep, was clearly beyond his reach entirely. He reportedly cried out in dismay upon seeing the row of stale loaves laid before him, asking aloud what he was now supposed to do and where he was meant to go, lamenting that death seemed to have already taken up residence in his own bedchamber, following him wherever he turned, no matter how far he travelled or how hard he fought against it. Deeply disappointed and prepared finally to return home empty-handed, Gilgamesh began making arrangements for his journey back to Uruk, accompanied once again by the ferryman Urshanabi, who was to receive an extended banishment from Utnapishtim's shores as a consequence of having brought Gilgamesh across the waters of death in the first place, a decision that meant Urshanabi would now be returning to Uruk alongside Gilgamesh rather than remaining in his previous role. Utnapishtim offered no further ceremony as the two men prepared to depart, having already said everything he believed needed saying, though his wife lingered near the shore a moment longer than necessary, watching the pair make their final preparations with an expression the story describes as something close to genuine sympathy, unwilling to see a man who had travelled so impossibly far leave with nothing at all to show for his effort. Before the two of them departed, however, Utnapishtim's wife, apparently moved by some measure of sympathy for the tremendous distance Gilgamesh had travelled, and the profound grief that had driven him to attempt this journey in the first place, urged her husband to offer him some small consolation for his trouble before sending him away completely empty-handed. She reminded Utnapishtim of the hardships Gilgamesh had endured to reach their distant shore, the darkness of the tunnel, the deadly waters he had crossed, and the sheer desperation that had carried him this far, arguing that a man who had travelled so far deserved something to carry home with him, even if that something fell short of what he had originally come seeking. Relenting to this request, Utnapishtim revealed to Gilgamesh the existence of a special plant growing at the very bottom of the sea, a thorny plant capable, according to Utnapishtim, of restoring youth and vitality to anyone who consumed it, though notably not granting true immortality itself, but rather a renewal of youthful vigour for whoever managed to obtain and eat it. Gilgamesh, seizing eagerly upon this final opportunity, tied heavy stones to his feet to weigh himself down and allow him to sink to the ocean floor, and there he successfully located and retrieved the thorny plant, cutting himself somewhat in the process, given its sharp, protective spines, but ultimately securing it and returning triumphantly to the surface and cutting away the stones that had carried him down to the depths. He surfaced gasping, holding the plant aloft above the water before Urshanabi could even reach out to help pull him back aboard, examining its thorny stem with something close to disbelief at having actually succeeded where he had failed so completely with the earlier test of endurance. Overjoyed at finally having something tangible to bring back with him, even if it fell considerably short of the true immortality he had originally set out to find, Gilgamesh declared his intention to bring the plant back to Uruk, planning to share its rejuvenating properties among the elders of his city before eventually consuming a portion of it himself as well, a plan that, had it succeeded, would have marked a genuinely meaningful, if imperfect, triumph after everything Gilgamesh had endured throughout his long and grueling journey. He imagined, as he and Urshanabi began the long return voyage, the reaction of his own council of elders upon learning that their king had returned not with an army or with plunder, but with a gift capable of restoring the vigour of youth to anyone willing to share in it, a gesture that might finally begin repairing the harm his earlier tyranny had caused among his own people. But fate and a single moment of carelessness during the journey home would ultimately deny him even this smaller consolation prize, in a twist that stands among the most quietly devastating moments in the entire story. The loss of the plant and the return to Uruk. As Gilgamesh and Urshanabi made their way back toward Uruk, the journey brought them past a pool of cool, refreshing water, and Gilgamesh, understandably eager after everything he had endured to finally wash away the grime and exhaustion of his long journey, stopped to bathe himself in its waters. While he was occupied with this simple, understandable act of basic self-care, setting the precious plant down carefully nearby while he bathed, a serpent emerged unnoticed from a crack in the ground and seized the plant, consuming it entirely before slithering away, shedding its own skin immediately afterward as visible proof of the rejuvenating power the plant had genuinely possessed, a power now lost to Gilgamesh forever through nothing more than a single moment of inattention. This detail regarding the serpent's shed skin offered the ancient audience a satisfying, almost poetic explanation for why snakes alone among all creatures seem to renew themselves this way, periodically shedding their old skin and emerging looking younger and brighter, while humanity, despite Gilgamesh's best efforts, never has. Upon realizing what had happened, discovering the plant gone and the discarded snake skin lying nearby as unmistakable evidence of what had occurred, Gilgamesh was overcome with a profound grief and despair, unlike anything he had experienced even earlier in his journey, weeping openly at the realization that he had travelled such an immense distance, endured such extraordinary hardship, and secured this singular consolation prize, only to lose it through nothing more than a moment of careless inattention while simply trying to wash himself clean. He lamented aloud that he had laboured for nothing, gaining no lasting benefit whatsoever from his entire arduous journey, and that the serpent, rather than himself, would now be the one to enjoy the plant's rejuvenating properties. Gilgamesh sat down beside the pool where the theft had occurred and wept, and Urshanabi, watching his companion's grief, offered what comfort he could, though there was little to be said that might ease the particular sting of a loss so entirely accidental and so entirely irreversible. A king who had survived monsters, floods, and a journey to the very edge of the world had lost everything to something as small and as ordinary as a snake slipping unnoticed out of a crack in the earth. Despite this crushing final disappointment, something notable shifted within Gilgamesh during the remainder of his journey home, a gradual acceptance beginning to settle over him regarding the fundamental limits of mortal existence. Rather than continuing to rage against the unfairness of his situation, or seeking out yet another desperate scheme to escape his own mortality, Gilgamesh instead began turning his attention back toward Uruk itself, and the accomplishments that had always been genuinely within his own reach and control, even if eternal life itself had never truly been one of them. The remainder of the voyage passed largely in silence between the two men, Gilgamesh watching the shoreline slip by without the restless urgency that had defined every earlier stage of his journey, Urshanabi content to let his companion sit quietly with his own thoughts, rather than pressing him for conversation. When Gilgamesh and Urshanabi finally arrived back at Uruk, Gilgamesh did something the story treats as deeply significant, inviting Urshanabi to climb the city's massive walls alongside him and survey the entirety of what lay beneath them, walls that Gilgamesh himself had commissioned and overseen the construction of during his own reign as king. The guards at the city gates, seeing their king approach after so long an absence, hesitated for a moment before recognizing him beneath the weathered skins and unkempt beard, some later recalling that his eyes carried a different quality than before he had left, less restless, less consumed by the constant, exhausting need for conquest and challenge that had once defined nearly everything he did. He pointed out the sheer scale and craftsmanship of these walls, describing the fired bricks used in their construction. The foundation lay deep beneath the surface, upon a bed of solid stone, and the sprawling city protected within their boundaries, including its gardens, its clay pits where the very bricks of the wall had originally been fired, its open plots of land, and the great temple dedicated to Ishtar standing prominently among the surrounding structures. Urshanabi, walking the length of the wall beside him, offered his own quiet admiration for what he saw, remarking that few cities anywhere he had travelled could claim fortifications built with such evident care and lasting intent, a comment Gilgamesh received with visible pride, the first genuine satisfaction he had shown since setting out on his long and grief-driven journey so many months earlier. This closing gesture, returning full circle to the very description of Uruk's walls that had opened the entire story so many events earlier, suggests a hard-won and deeply meaningful shift in Gilgamesh's own understanding of what genuine, lasting immortality might actually look like for a mortal being. Rather than escaping death itself, which the story makes abundantly and repeatedly clear, no mortal, however strong or however determined, could ever hope to accomplish, Gilgamesh instead seemed to find a measure of peace in recognizing that the tangible, lasting accomplishments of his own reign, the walls he had built, the city he had shaped and governed, and the stories that would inevitably be told about his extraordinary adventures for generations to come, offered him something genuinely enduring. After all, a form of immortality built not from escaping death, but from leaving behind something meaningful and lasting for those who would continue living long after he himself was gone. Standing atop that wall with Urshanabi beside him, Gilgamesh was said to have finally set aside the animal skins he had worn throughout his long wandering, calling for proper garments to be brought to him, a small but telling gesture marking his return not just to Uruk itself, but to the responsibilities and identity of the king he had once been, before grief had driven him away from everything familiar. The city below them stretched out in careful, deliberate order, an area the text describes as comprising roughly equal thirds of city proper, garden land, and open clay pits, altogether forming a settlement whose scale and permanence stood as a genuine achievement in its own right, regardless of anything Gilgamesh himself had failed to accomplish during his long and arduous journey. This return to Uruk, and the wisdom Gilgamesh ultimately gained from his long and difficult journey, represents the central emotional resolution of the epic as it has survived to us today, though the broader story and its legacy did not end there, extending forward across thousands of years into a completely different, considerably more modern chapter, involving the eventual rediscovery, translation, and rebirth of this extraordinarily ancient story after it had lain forgotten and buried beneath the sands for well over 2,000 years. Beyond the main narrative that carries through from Gilgamesh's grief to his eventual return home, one additional and somewhat separate episode survives among the ancient tablets, an appendix of sorts that offers a rare and detailed glimpse into how the ancient Mesopotamians imagined the underworld itself, a place mentioned only briefly and in passing throughout the rest of the epic. Enkidu's descent into the netherworld. This additional episode, preserved on what is generally counted as a 12th tablet and believed to have originally existed as a separate older Sumerian poem before being appended to the end of the main story, opens with Gilgamesh losing two treasured objects, sometimes translated as a drum and a drumstick, into a crack that had opened in the earth, the objects falling down into the underworld itself and becoming lost to him. Distressed by the loss, Gilgamesh sat by the opening and wept over his inability to retrieve them. The objects themselves were said to have been fashioned from the wood of a tree Gilgamesh had once tended in his own garden, a tree he had originally hoped to shape into a throne and bed for himself before Ishtar took an interest in it, and after a series of complications involving creatures that had made their home within its trunk, the wood was eventually given over instead to crafting these two treasured items, making their loss into the underworld all the more painful given the effort that had originally gone into creating them. Enkidu, still very much alive within this particular version of events, offered to descend into the underworld himself to retrieve the lost objects on his friend's behalf. Before he departed, Gilgamesh gave him a careful list of instructions meant to ensure his safe return, warning him specifically about a long list of behaviors he needed to avoid while down among the dead, including wearing clean clothing that might mark him as an outsider, wearing sandals that would make noise as he walked, carrying a weapon that might provoke the spirits around him, kissing his beloved wife or child, striking anyone in anger, or otherwise drawing any kind of attention to himself whatsoever, since doing any of these ordinary everyday things would risk permanently trapping him below. Gilgamesh delivered these warnings with visible worry, repeating certain points twice and pressing Enkidu to commit each restriction firmly to memory, aware from long experience of just how easily his friend's own strong-willed nature might override careful planning once he found himself caught up in the moment. Enkidu, however, ignored every single one of these careful warnings once he actually arrived in the underworld, behaving exactly as Gilgamesh had instructed him not to, and as a direct result, he found himself seized and permanently held by the underworld itself, unable to return to the surface no matter how desperately he tried. Gilgamesh, upon realizing his friend had failed to return, went before the assembly of gods pleading for help in recovering him, and though several of the gods refused to intervene, the god Ea eventually agreed to help, arranging for a small opening to be made in the earth through which Enkidu's spirit, though not his physical body, could briefly rise up and speak with Gilgamesh one final time. Through this brief opening, Gilgamesh was able to speak with his friend's spirit, and the two embraced as best they could given the circumstances. Gilgamesh, desperate to understand what awaited the dead, asked Enkidu to describe the nature of the underworld to him, and what followed was an unusually detailed and often somber account of the fate awaiting the deceased. Enkidu explained that the underworld operated under its own strict order, with Ereshkigal ruling as its queen, and a scribe named Belet Seri recording the names and deeds of every soul that arrived before her, maintaining careful account of who had lived honourably and who had not, information that seemed to shape, at least in part, the particular conditions each spirit would experience during their unending stay below. Enkidu described how a person's condition in the afterlife depended considerably on the circumstances of their death and the number of children left behind to properly honour their memory through offerings and ritual. Those who died with many sons to remember them and pour offerings on their behalf were said to rest in relative comfort, while others who died alone, through violence, or without any family left to honour them, were described as facing considerably harsher and more miserable conditions in the world below. He went further still, describing the particular fates awaiting specific categories of the dead. A man with 7 sons resting comfortably among the lesser gods, listening to music. A stillborn infant, never having known life at all, playing endlessly at a table set with golden and silver dishes. And by grim contrast, a person whose body had been left unburied and abandoned to rot in the open field, their spirit finding no rest whatsoever, wandering without comfort, since no one remained to perform the proper offerings on their behalf. This episode, though somewhat disconnected from the main emotional arc of Gilgamesh's grief and quest for immortality found elsewhere in the epic, offers modern readers a genuinely valuable window into how the ancient Mesopotamians pictured the fate awaiting every person after death, a bleak, dust-filled, and largely undifferentiated existence in most cases, softened only somewhat by the comfort of being properly remembered and honoured by those left behind among the living, a detail that adds considerable additional weight and context to Gilgamesh's own desperate fear of death, and his equally desperate wish to leave behind something lasting enough to ensure he too would be remembered long after his own passing. Taken together with the rest of the epic, this glimpse into the underworld helps explain why Gilgamesh's journey carried such urgency throughout, since the alternative to finding some form of lasting remembrance was not simply non-existence, but a specific, joyless continuation of existence in darkness, a fate every character within the story, mortal and divine alike, seemed to regard with genuine dread. With this fuller understanding of how the ancient Mesopotamians imagined death and the underworld, the broader significance of Gilgamesh's entire journey becomes even clearer, and the story of how this ancient tale eventually made its way back into human awareness after thousands of years of complete silence becomes all the more remarkable in its own right. The rediscovery of the epic. For roughly 2,000 years following the collapse of the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations that had originally created, preserved, and told this story, the Epic of Gilgamesh existed nowhere in human memory or awareness whatsoever. Its clay tablets buried beneath the ruins of cities that had themselves crumbled and vanished beneath the desert sands of what is now modern Iraq. The story's very existence, along with the entire civilization that had produced it, was almost completely forgotten, remembered only in the barest, most fragmentary and indirect references buried within other, later ancient texts that occasionally hinted at its existence without ever revealing anything close to its true content or significance. This changed dramatically during the 19th century, when archaeologists working in the region began excavating the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, uncovering vast collections of clay tablets covered in the wedge-shaped writing system known as cuneiform, one of the very earliest writing systems ever developed by human civilization. Among the most significant of these discoveries was the enormous library of King Ashurbanipal, an ancient Assyrian ruler who had assembled an extraordinary collection of texts at his palace in Nineveh centuries after the story of Gilgamesh had first been composed, preserving countless works of literature, history, and religious texts from across the ancient world, including several surviving copies and fragments of the Gilgamesh story itself, inscribed onto tablets that had survived remarkably intact despite the eventual destruction and burning of the library itself. In something of a strange twist, the very fire that destroyed Nineveh when the city fell to invading forces around the year 612, before the Common Era, proved instrumental in preserving these particular tablets rather than erasing them entirely, since the intense heat of that destruction effectively baked and hardened the clay, turning what might otherwise have crumbled away over the following centuries into durable, fired ceramic capable of surviving buried beneath the ruins for well over 2,000 years until archaeologists finally uncovered them. These tablets were eventually transported to museums in Europe, where scholars began the painstaking, decades-long process of learning to read and translate the ancient cuneiform script, a written language that had been completely unreadable to anyone for well over 2,000 years by the time these tablets were first uncovered. It was during this careful process of translation that a museum assistant named George Smith, a man who had originally trained as an engraver and taught himself cuneiform largely through his own persistence and fascination with the subject during lunch breaks spent examining tablets at the museum, made an extraordinary discovery while examining and translating a portion of the tablets in his care during the early 1870s. Smith found himself reading an account of a devastating flood that bore striking and unmistakable similarities to the flood story found in the biblical Book of Genesis, a discovery so significant and so unexpected that, according to widely repeated accounts of the moment, Smith became so overwhelmed with excitement upon fully grasping the implications of what he had just read that he reportedly began undressing himself in his excitement, right there among his colleagues, in an unrestrained expression of pure scholarly astonishment at what he had just uncovered. This discovery of the flood narrative within the Gilgamesh tablets caused a considerable sensation once it was announced publicly, drawing enormous attention from scholars, religious figures, and the general public alike, given its profound implications for understanding the relationship between this ancient Mesopotamian story and similar flood narratives found within other ancient traditions and religious texts. The parallels were, and remain, genuinely striking, a divine warning delivered to a single righteous man, detailed instructions for constructing a vessel capable of preserving life, the loading of animals aboard, a storm lasting a fixed number of days, the vessel eventually coming to rest upon a mountain, and the release of birds to determine whether the floodwaters had receded. A sequence of events close enough between the two accounts that scholars have spent well over a century since Smith's discovery debating exactly how the two traditions might be related, whether through shared ancient memory of some real regional flooding event, through direct cultural transmission between neighbouring civilizations, or through some combination of both possibilities. Newspapers of the day covered the announcement extensively, and a wealthy London newspaper eventually funded Smith to travel personally to the site of ancient Nineveh in search of any missing fragments that might complete the story further, a journey that, remarkably, resulted in Smith locating an additional piece of the very tablet he needed within days of beginning his search, a stroke of good fortune so unlikely that it remains a favourite anecdote among historians of archaeology to this day. Additional expeditions were subsequently funded and organised specifically to search for any missing portions of the story still buried within the ruins of Nineveh, gradually piecing together a more complete understanding of the epic across the following decades of continued archaeological work and scholarly translation efforts. Since this initial rediscovery in the 19th century, our understanding of the Epic of Gilgamesh has continued to grow and develop considerably, as additional tablets and fragments have been uncovered through ongoing excavations, and as scholars have continued refining their understanding of the ancient Akkadian and Sumerian languages in which various versions of the story were originally composed, across the many centuries during which it continued to be copied, retold, and gradually expanded upon by successive generations of ancient scribes. Scribal schools across ancient Mesopotamia appear to have used portions of the Gilgamesh story as part of their standard training for young students learning to read and write cuneiform, meaning that generations of Mesopotamian scribes grew up copying out passages from the epic as part of their earliest education, embedding the story deeply within the broader intellectual and literary culture of the region for well over 1,000 years before it finally fell out of circulation entirely. Beyond the main Akkadian version pieced together by later scholars, the story of Gilgamesh appears to have travelled remarkably far throughout the ancient world during those intervening centuries, with fragments and adaptations of the story uncovered, written not only in Akkadian and the earlier Sumerian language, but also in Hittite and Hurrian, languages spoken by civilizations located considerably further north and west of Mesopotamia itself, in what is now modern Turkey and the surrounding region. This wide geographic spread suggests that the story of Gilgamesh held genuine and lasting cultural significance across a considerable portion of the ancient Near East, translated and adapted by neighbouring civilizations who found something worth preserving and retelling within its themes of friendship, loss, and the search for meaning in the face of mortality, long before any of these societies had contact with the civilizations of ancient Greece that would later produce their own equally enduring stories of heroism and loss. Fragments discovered at sites associated with these neighbouring cultures sometimes show notable variation from the Akkadian original, condensing certain episodes, expanding others, and occasionally shifting emphasis in ways that reflect the particular concerns of the audience receiving the translation. Evidence that the story was never treated as a fixed, untouchable text, but rather as a living tradition, reshaped again and again by each new community that chose to make it their own. Today, the epic is widely recognized as one of the oldest surviving works of great literature produced by human civilization, offering modern readers a remarkable and genuinely moving window into how some of the very earliest urban civilizations on Earth grappled with the same fundamental questions of friendship, mortality, grief, and the search for lasting meaning that continue to occupy human thought and conversation even today, thousands of years after the story was first pressed into wet clay somewhere along the banks of the Euphrates River. Modern translators and scholars continue publishing new editions of the epic even now, each attempt bringing fresh nuance to lines that remain partially damaged or missing altogether on the original tablets, a reminder that despite everything already recovered, portions of this remarkable story remain permanently lost, buried perhaps forever beneath the same desert sands that once concealed the entire work for 2,000 years. Even so, what has survived remains more than enough to carry the story forward, a testament to just how much of Gilgamesh's own hard-won wisdom about memory and legacy managed to prove true, regardless of anything the gods themselves ever intended when they first sent a wild man out of the clay to challenge him. The story of Gilgamesh, a king who began his rule as a tyrant, found his equal in a wild man shaped from river clay, lost that companion to the judgment of the gods, and wandered to the very edge of the world searching for an escape from death he was never destined to find, ultimately returned home, not with the immortality he had originally sought, but with something else entirely, a hard-won understanding that the walls he built, the city he shaped, and the story that would eventually be told about his extraordinary life might just be the closest thing to lasting immortality that any mortal being, however strong, however desperate, or however deeply grieving, could ever truly hope to achieve. Fittingly, the ancient tablets themselves close much as they began, with a final invitation for whoever encounters this story to climb those same walls, walk their length, and examine the very foundation where Gilgamesh was said to have hidden his own account of everything that had happened to him. A closing gesture that turns the entire epic into something like an open invitation extended across thousands of years, asking each new listener or reader to bear witness in turn to a life that refused, in its own way, to be forgotten. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.